Hello, everyone. I'm Miss Gian, and welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 2 of our Psychological Assessment course. Today, we're going to explore how psychological testing came to be, why culture matters so much in assessment, and the legal and ethical guidelines or guardrails that protect both test takers and professionals. And this chapter, although history is, and we have a bad connotation of history, mind you, it's the same hate that they get with math, especially with psych students. But kani pa yung psychometrics, aldaghag math. Tapos na pa yung chapter on history, but this is important because it's foundational. It will help us understand na testing isn't just about numbers and scores. It's really deeply connected to history, power, influence, culture, and of course, human rights. So, unsa man atong goal for this session, I want you to walk away with four key things. First, you'll be able to trace how psychological testing evolved from ancient China all the way to the modern times. Kay, di ba, snippet raman to ang chapter 1. When hisugod na yung ta ni Alfred Binet, there's more. I told you there was more. And it started in China. And second, you'll understand why culture matters so much in assessment. We'll see some examples of what happens when our assessors ignore these cultural factors. So it was a big deal back then. And it is now, but because there are already methods to standardize everything, it's less controversial. Then third, you'll know the major laws and court cases that shape testing practices, particularly in the Philippines. The source that we are using is very Western. So I will try my best to contextualize it as much as possible. So I have a Western counterpart of these legislations, but I've also searched up a few of the common Philippine legislations with regards to testing and assessment. But we end there. We are not going to discuss those Western examples of court cases because, to be honest, dili siya relatable, so di ra pud siya dali ma-register sa inyong utok, so might as well use the Philippine context, right? And of course, finally, you'll appreciate the rights that test takers have, so rights that didn't always exist and had to be fought for. So remember, everything that was established was because of extreme cases in the Western countries. You understand why in the next few slides, anong specific kayo ilahang legislations. And sa ato, of course, Philippines, I want you to understand na Philippines is still crawling even in testing. No, we're still crawling. We have a lot of tests na kanang dili pa siya mo apply sa kanang Filipino sample. Wala pa siya Filipino kanang counterpart, but it's slowly developing. Now we have a Filipino scale for ocean personality test. So, yeah, anyway, that's what we will be doing today. Now, psychological testing didn't start in a university lab or a clinic. It started in ancient China around 2200 BCE. And this is over 4000 years ago. So the Chinese developed civil service examinations to select government officials. The same as the Philippines, di ba? We still have the civil service examination. But mind you, China started this 4000 years ago pa. So before this, imuhang job is determined by your family. So kung anak ka sa farmer, then imuhang job farmer pod. Kung anak ka sa hari, imong job is of course ikay mo follow sa footsteps sa imong father. Pero kaning exams, it introduced a shift, no, a societal shift. It was a revolutionary idea na people were thinking na okay, maybe your position in society should be based on what you can actually do, not just who your parents were. And mo ni siyang kanang dako ka siya na shift from that kind of culture, no, na kung unsay imong family mao po nimong ma-inherit na work. Now it's based on skill because of these exams that started 4000 years ago. So unsa man ilang mga gipang test, we have actually everything from music, archery, to writing, arithmetic, and even knowledge of classical literature. And after that, they will then know their exams. It was very familiar and maybe practice in the modern times kay ipagawas dayon ko kinsa ang mga nakapasar. Murag sa board exams, right? Sana i-publish dito kinsa ang mga nakapasar, and wow kayo if makita nimo imong name wala day dito. So actually, I will tell you my experience when I was taking my board exam and waiting for the results, grabe akong anxiety. Wala ko'y anxiety na mahagbong ko. It's not that. It's what people will think. So, that's, I'm thinking ba na if I'm not afraid of failure, I'm afraid of how I am perceived by other people if they know that I did not pass. So, igana siya na pressure rather ang kaning ko ano. But, I don't know what's the kuan nga anong kailangan siya i-announce. May pag-i-tagsa-tagsa na lang sa email or kanang murag sa text ba na, hey, congrats, you passed. Basig ka, sa kapoy sa na over thousands of examinees man sa ng mga board exams. So, mo siguro nang ilan na lang i-post. So, yeah, mo to no. I mentioned earlier sa first chapter na if you pass, you have special privileges. So, kung sa man ni mga privileges, exemption sa taxes, special clothing, mura mo butangan og kanang garb na mo differentiate ninyo na okay passer ni siya sa kaning government exam or imperial exam. So ingon of course kung passer ka di ba bright ka so na kay special attention na kay respect na dili the same sa normal people. Char, normal people and you know even protection from torture. So mo na siya, di ba? Maning kamot gyud ta kay ikaw kuno na kanang section na di ka i-torture, di ba? Ganahan jud ta makapasar nga na exam. Kay imagine mo kung napa na karong kuan ko tag-colonize niya na atay torture po din niya. Kung makapasar ka sa exam, exempted na ka sa torture. Diba, bongga. Anyway. So yeah, fast forward to the 1800s and we see testing become more scientific. Mo na ni siya. So, kuan na siya, 19th century na ta. So, mo ni si Charles Darwin, dili man siya ang father of testing. Naka-influence siya ni Galton. So, si Charles Darwin, he published On the Origin of Species sa pag 1859. So, unsa man ni siya famous for? Famous for evolution and his work sparked interest sa individual differences. Diba? Survival of the fittest ni siya. And because of this kind of influence ni Darwin, scientists thought na how do we measure how people are different from each other because these people have differences. So, ni-enter dayon si Francis Galton. Nahadlok jud ko sa naong ni Galton, honestly. Mura siya, sorry, ayaw ko ungo Galton, pero hadlok ka siya na. Okay, going back. Si Galton is cousin ni siya ni Darwin. And he followed Darwin's idea. He ran with this idea. So, Galton created some of the first questionnaires, mga rating scales, mga self-report inventories. This man loves to count, loves to measure. And he even has a museum somewhere. I'm not sure. I have to verify this information, but there is a museum wherein naaiyahang tools where he counted pilakbok people ang pass by na he perceived as attractive and mo na ang counts of how many people ang percentage na attractive people in that certain state or area. I don't know if it was him, maybe I mixed him up with some other guy, but what I know is Galton really loves to measure. Okay, so because of his love sa measure, he set up a lab where people could pay a few cents niya maka-measure sila sa ilang grip strength, ilang reaction time, ilang color perception, and he also contribute to the development of correlation. Siya pinaka-first, and he influenced Carl Pearson. It's the very famous Pearson R. So si Galton ang naka-influence jud niya. Siya ang ga-contribute sa coefficient of correlation. It is a statistical concept that's very famous in research and hopefully this is foundational knowledge for you all. And in Germany, in the same timeline as when Francis Galton developed his practice, his laboratories na maka-measure na si Wilhelm Wundt. And he founded the first experimental psychology laboratory pag 1879. You guys have encountered him already time and time again. Na he is the father of modern psychology because of the experimental lab. So, kaning mga titles no, it's all human given something na dili magini mao iyang title but mao lang iyang gi-denote as because he established an experimental lab pinaka first. So, si Wundt, he was more interested in how people are similar, different kag Galton. In fact, for him, ang differences are errors. So, if naay human differences or individual differences, for him, it is an error in his measurement. So, kontra ni Galton, he is more interested in the similarities sa mga tao. And this is where we encounter and where the concept standardization was formed. Unsa ning standardization because you will be hearing this again and again and again. So it's making sure tests are given the same way every time. Kay if not, you cannot really say na reliable and valid imong result na makuha. Because imagine if the weather actually has a huge effect on your testing. Say, panalitan, mga kanding, di man na sila ganahan o ka ng exams. So, mga kanding na group A, gipatest na while nag-exam sila. Nya, hayag kayo to, kanang walay uwan. Si group B na mga kanding, gipatest sila na nag-uwan. Of course, si group B kanding, maglisod yun. Kay kandingon, di man ganang mga uwan ang kanding, di ba? So, di sila makafocus sa exam. So, wala ko lingon ha na nadyo mga kanding na ma-exam. So, I'm just simplifying stuff here. So, inga na siya. So, man na naka-coin si, or si Wilhelm na kanang everything should be standardized. And ang one of the students ni Wundt is si Cattell. Si James McKean Cattell. And he is an American who would coin the term mental test in 1890, which brought testing to America. Sa America man jud god ni boom ang testing. Diri jud pinakagamit ang testing. So kanang mo to siya. And he founded Psychological Corporation in 1921. So kaning upat kabuk pioneers, si Darwin, si Galton, si Wundt, and si Cattell, they all laid the groundwork for modern psychological testing. So I have here a food for thought. So my question is, think about the ancient Chinese civil service exams. And in what ways do modern standardized tests like college entrance exams serve similar purposes? Okay, so you can pause the video, think about it 2 to 3 minutes, write down your answers. You want to really engage in this video lecture, and it might help in our kanang later orals exam. And yeah, anyway, let's move on to the 20th century where things really took off. So in 1905, a French psychologist named Alfred Binet, this was who I introduced you in chapter 1. He was working with Theodore Simon, and he created a 30-item test to identify children in Paris schools who needed extra help. So this was the first formal intelligence test. What's important to understand is Binet iyang test is really practical. It was just designed to help kids dili i-label sila permanently. Just really place them in appropriate school placements. But as the test spread its influence and importance all around the world, and it went through a lot of revisions, and it launched two huge movements. First is intelligence testing, and testing sa clinical psychology. Why I put an important bit of information why kani si Binet, ang iya yung goal is to have proper placements, kay na misuse magud ni ang iyahang test ni Goddard. I will talk to you later about that one. Really a sad story no for the testing history. But anyway, let's look at first ang mga key developments after Binet. So pag 1939, so nani siya no, 1939, si David Wechsler, he created his own test for adults, and it is what we call the Wechsler-Bellevue Intelligence Scale. And how Wechsler defined intelligence, it's different by how Binet defined intelligence. So, giyon sa niya pag-define ng intelligence, for him, intelligence is the capacity to act purposefully, think rationally, and deal effectively with one's environment. So, of course, because different iyang conceptualization sa intelligence, different pud ang iyang mga contents, iyang test item. And yeah, did you know that his test is still used widely today? Kay, I don't know, favorite siya sa mga people na ay WAIS, WAIS, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. Na po na siya counterpart where na ay mga appeal na mga children, no? Because back then, wala pa yung minors involved, so di pa siya pwede gamitan sa mga younger children, and then wala pa dyan yung mga minorities involved, so di ta kaingon na gamit siya and valid siya for other population with different culture. Well, anyway, and so pag late 1930s, there were approximately 4,000 different psychological tests in print. So ni boom gyud siya maayo. And at that time, ang clinical psychology was basically synonymous with mental testing, and that's how central testing became to the field of psychology. Now, kay World War is actually the catalyst for mass testing. Kani jud ang World War nakaingon kung kuan pa ni murag sila ang pabuto, sila ang turutot. Okay, so sila jud ang nakaingon nganong ni spread out yun ni maayo ang testing. Ang two world wars, they change everything about how psychological tests are used. Kay during World War I, ang military, they needed a quick way to screen thousands and thousands of recruits. Okay, so of course, you couldn't test everyone individually. Wala may time. Kasi pabuthan na sila no na nagtesting pa sila gi-analyze. Sorry, it's not bad. It's bad to joke. Sorry. 'Di ba? It's diri na birth ang group testing. So, mao ni siyang na birth dayon ang group intelligence test money because of World War I. And they also created something that you call personal data sheet kani and basically kaning personal data sheet dili ni mao inyong answeran when you enroll. It's a pen and paper pencil interview to screen mga psychological problems because it's important that they hire military recruits that are intelligent, psychologically healthy individuals. Kay they needed that, of course, matrauma baya no. Ikaw kuno makita na imong friend na kuyog nimo sa imong bunk kay mabutan lang in front of your very eyes, right? So they needed people that are very enduring ana. So naa na sila mga qualifications. And yeah, unsa may mga questions aning personal data sheet. For example, are you troubled with the idea that people are watching you on the street? Mura siya testing out paranoia, di ba? And this was the first widely used na self-report personality test. Now, come World War II, and it expanded this even further. Ang psychologists, they developed more tests, they administered them to millions of soldiers, and they refined their interpretation methods. Now, when the war ended, all these psychologists, they returned to civilian life. And of course, what they learned with testing with soldiers, they applied it to their practice. They applied it into their normal life where when may war, of course, so mabalik na sila silang own clinics, and what the skills that they learned there, they applied it in their practice. So they brought this knowledge, this entire stuff to corporations, schools, hospitals, and again in their individual clinics. So we saw now approaches na ni-emerge because nganong ni-emerge man yung projective test kay encountering meaning iyang gi challenge ang self-report measures ingon na okay, it has the tendency for manipulation, but also do people really know who they are? Okay, so mo siyang ni emerge dayon ang kanang sitagani kanang projective tests. Yeah, so unsa ni projective test, they are shown an image. It's an ambiguous image. Usually, if you see an ink blot, that is the Rorschach ink blots. Hatagan mo picture ana tapos pahimuon mo story. And whatever stories you develop out of the picture, it has symbols ba. For example, ang women sa picture symbolizes you. There naka-undergo na kog TAT. So naay picture dito na women, ya sa luyo niya na ay murag heels, niya ana, niya himuan nimo nag picture at pagtanon ka sa administrator or psychologist ana na kanang usay story nimo aning kanina picture tapos moingon ka na okay ang women kay kanang negosyo sa iyang go after siya sa iyang dreams, ni look back siya sa iyang hometown, ana ila din ang i-analyze imong the way you frame the stories, ana niya nana siya equivalent every time na moingon ka kaning woman equivalent to you, and then the book is maybe pertaining to your aspirations in life. Ingana na ang TAT no, so kaning mga pictures na ay mga subjects, ang mga subjects na siya various stimuli for interpretation. So mana projective test na sila. So in short, ang wars, they turbocharge ang testing industry, di ba? Di ba, ay mura siyag pabuto. Siya gid ang murag ni boom sa kanina field, sa kaning psychological testing. So, let's go now sa culture and assessment. And unsa din ang culture sa psychological testing? Because you will also encounter this in your social psychology, culture and psychology. No, culture is embedded in the course. Interchange, cousin siya. So saan ang culture? Culture is the socially transmitted behavior, patterns, beliefs, and products of work of a particular population, community, or group of people. So ang kaning culture, it teaches us so much how to communicate, how to treat our elders. Example, magmano po ta, that's the culture of Pinoy that was influenced by colonization sa Spain. You don't see Westerners say mano po, right? You cannot see that. How to raise children. It also teaches us what to value, what to reject, even what we expect from ourselves and others. Now, why are we talking about culture here sa psychological assessment? Kay as future psychologists, it's important to understand na ang influence ni culture is so strong on a person's thoughts and behavior. Remember, ang imong gisample, imong gikuha sa testing is ilahang behavior. So malamang ma-influence na sa ilahang culture. So that's why today ang assessment professionals, we are much more aware of cultural issues. So ang ASEAN even has these movements right now. Okay, let's step out from a very Western-centric conceptualization of clinical interventions. Dili na taan na natay atong own interventions that is more relevant to our culture. Let's step out from personality testing that is very Western. We have our own. We should make our own. Yan, ano, grabe na kayo ang ASEAN in terms of that kind of movement. So, we think about culture when we're developing tests now, we're administering them, we're scoring them, and then when we're making decisions based on results. So, that's why in your research sa fourth year, it's really important na inyong test na makuha, especially if Western inyong gamit na mga test, inyo dyan na siyang i-norm sa Filipino population. Meaning to say, mag-pilot testing mo sa Filipino sample, and then inyong tanawon, basig na items dira na dili da ay reliable. Na ay math for that. We have math to test out whether a certain item is valid and reliable for that certain population. So we're sensitive now with regards to testing and assessment, and we should apply it in our practice. And why am I talking about this kind of development? This is important to know, kay it wasn't always this way. There's a dark history na we need to learn from so we don't repeat those mistakes. And I mentioned about Binay's test being misused, and this is how it was misused. Si Henry Goddard sa Ellis Island. Okay? So, let me tell you about Henry Goddard. And unsa din nitabo aning Ellis Island. So, pag early 1900s, si Goddard, iyang gigamit ang test ni Binet, iyang gi-translate o iyang gi-screen ang immigrants na padulong sa United States. Mind you, through boat na sila ha, i-transport sa through boat, and then inigabot nila, ipatest dayon sila. So, shocking ka iyang findings, kay iyang gi-report through this, kuan niya, kabobohan, sorry, I'm so sorry, through his misuse, iyang gi-report na ang kaning Jews, 83%, ang 80% sa Hungarians, 79% sa Italians, and 87% sa Russians are feeble-minded. In the time, feeble-minded is the same as having a mental deficiency. Or, for lack of a better word, because they actually use this term, they call them morons. Okay? Mo na siya. Maninigawa sa iyang test. Now, think about that for a second. Does that make any sense? Dako agad ani na percentages, right? And it's what he found out. Of course not. Not right. So what actually happened? Nga naman weird. Can you really say 83% of the Jews are morons? No, because it was misused. The test was misused. So what actually happened was pag-translate sa test, na overestimate ang mental deficiency because they are not native English speakers. Now, these immigrants, they were being tested in an unfamiliar language about unfamiliar things that they don't know about because it's not part of their culture, often after a long and exhausting journey. Gikan pa na sila biyahe. So, remember, ang test takers situation, disposition, also matters. Gikan kag grabe kay kag biyahe, imagine gikan kag Bohol nya dritso dayon grabe kay balud din na ano agian pa mo Bagyo pag abot nimo dritso di kag midterm exam. Of course, you will be affected by that, right? So, ang kaning si Goddard, iyahang story, iyahang history, maybe he was not doing it on purpose. He just really misused the test. And looking back, he probably have thought, hala, buguan ako, no? Basi mo ni na-think ni Goddard, no? Kaya naana siya sa tanang psychological textbook. He is an example for one of the biggest example for a misuse sa test. But, we need to learn from this one. So, first, what are the lessons that we need to learn? First is na ay language barrier. And this will tremendously affect one's performance. Okay? Mana siyang na non-verbal. No? Non-verbal intelligence test, it teaches us logic, rationalization, and normally pattern recognition. So makikita mo mga imbis na kanang math, English ang inyong i-test out, ang test item, makikita mo shapes ang iyang test item to combat language barriers sa testing. Now, second, cultural unfamiliarity is not equal to to lack of ability. But in the cases, some tests might be mistaken, no, na dili ka familiar sa ilang culture, mo igawas sa result dayon lack of ability siya. Now, third test developed for one population may not be valid for another. And I forgot to put it here, ang last one. And the fourth one is naay consequences if we have if we conduct testing that is wrong. It's devastating. Okay? People were turned away from a new life based on faulty assessments. Imagine, 83% sa Jews wala naka-enter sa US because of that. Okay? And later I'll tell you about a case of a girl who really was affected by a certain konang testing, no? So anyway, early tests like Stanford Binet and mga Wechsler Bellevue, they were also developed without minority children. I mentioned that in the previous slide. And there were test items that assumed knowledge only on certain people. So for example, na-test item dito na loaf of bread. Now, Hispanic children, they're not familiar with a loaf of bread because they were raised and they only know about tortillas. Okay? So, mo na siyang unfamiliar siya. How unsa ni? I don't understand this test item. So, in my experience sa testing po, kaka-experience po kong mga personality test ba na? I prefer to ride the train compared to sa to I prefer to ride the train compared to cars. Something magaro na inga na siya, no. Ang kadting ko, this does not apply to Cebuanos. We don't have trains in Cebu. So, ana siya, no, there are items. If you try to look at the Western items of a test, there are a lot of items there na dili gyud siya ma-apply sa Filipino sample. So today, we need to work hard to avoid these problems. So how do we do this? We use diverse samples, we analyze for biases, and then we all, of course, ensure na their standardization sa groups, it represents the actual population. Mag-standardize kag test din niya imuhang sample, mga sample ready sa students sa CTU. The other schools cannot use it kay nabi a particular culture na that's unique to CTU students alone compared to say UP students or CNU students, diba? So dapat when you standardize groups, it should represent the entire Filipino sample. So I have here the second question. So think about your own cultural background. How might aspects of your culture, communication style, for example, your values, your nonverbal behaviors, affect how you perform on a psychological test developed in a different culture? Okay, so think about mga nuances sa language, how quickly you respond, eye contact na norms, attitude towards authority. So what I hope you're thinking is that ang culture is not just about language. They're not about language. It's one, but it's not all. It's not all about language. So it shapes everything about how we interact with the testing situation, how we interpret stuff, etc. No? So dako kay siya influence yun. So let's now move on to tests and group membership. Now, what happens when groups systematically differ in their scores on a particular test? So the answer in one word is conflict. Why? There are two views on that. Two group scores that are different. Okay? Na ay two perspective for that. I will conceptualize how they are different. Okay? So, for example, ay height requirement ay na ay color requirement sa mga kanding na ang makapasara ng mga kanding is katong color white. Kanya i-test out dayon na okay kani black siya di siya kasulod. Kani white okay sulod ni siya. Now, the two groups they differ because of their colors of fur. Now, naay two views ana what will happen daw if they systematically differ sa score sa test. So, ang view one is that test validity matters. So, test measures what they're designed to measure. And group differences reflect real differences in skills. So, katumakanding, nag-test out, basig ang fur na white is, ang yung meat is mas, kuan yun, no? Mas juicy and tenderlicious, juicylicious, nga na yung meat sa kanding. Actually, di ko mukha o kanding. Kaya nako'y pet na kanding before. Ako pa nga niya kay si Kay Jean. Nya, love kito siya na ako na kanding niya. Kita man dyan ko giun sa pagpatay si Kay Jean, manang ludan dyan ko meat na kanding, right? Di ko mukha og kanding. But, anyway, for the example lang ni siya. So say ang naay kanang fur na white na kanding, kay lami daw, and then ang black kay dili ni tinuod basig na ay farmer din hamo type na ma'am na unsa man ka ma'am wrong man ka ma'am napataka ra man ka di man ka agriculture na student basig na mo nga na ha dili ako ra dyan ning mga example na para mo simplify ang stuff. So, mo to siya. Ingon ang view 1, perspective 1, it's a big idea na, na differences. Lahi man sila skin, lahi man sila kanang colors of fur. So, ang white, na siya percentage jud na usually ang mga white na mga kanding mas juicy gyud og meat. So mo na siya no na ingon diri na kanang ningon po si Gottfredson na society is best served by addressing gaps in skills between groups rather than lowering achievement standards or attacking valid tests. Kung moingon ta na, uy, ang checklist ni farmer kay correct man jud. Okay, correct man na assess man gyud niya na ang white kay 83% ni nga na and correlated pa gyud siya sa customer satisfaction. And ang black fur na kanding is medyo gahi siyang meat so dili na lang naton ikuan. Well, valid man ang test, no? According to the math reliability score niya o validity score, valid man siya. So, nanong imo mang usbon because na ay group na kuano na let's say kasi tagani na kanang bias siya sa certain group mo ni siya ang view 1. Now ang view 2 is level the playing field. So naa siya gitawag na affirmative action. So sa ning affirmative action? Voluntary and mandatory efforts to combat discrimination and promote equal opportunity in education and employment. So mo to siya kanang i-address siya ang inequities through modified scoring or selection procedures. So mag-contrast ang second view ug ang first view. Debate siya even until now. So, in terms sa hiring decisions, dili na ta mag example o mga kanding. A real world example na ta. Example sa hiring sa mga police. Okay, na ay height requirement na dapat ang mga police is 5'4", or mga flight stewardess. Dapat ang mga flight attendants dapat 5 up. Diba? So, kani siya na requirement sa height, exclude members of a certain population because what if the average population of that nationality is 5 below? Filipinos are short people. So, say if kani siya na height requirement, na naka-reside sa very, very diverse group of, in a country where there are diverse people like US, and ang kanina company, ilan gi play out na hiring qualification sa usa ka airline. And so, they might systematically exclude the Filipino people in their hirings, right? It's members of a certain group. And the debate here it plays out. Is this discrimination or is it a legitimate job requirement? The height requirement, what is it for? Why is it there? So, it is still a debate even until now. It's an ongoing debate of the two groups. But the truth is, benevolent, fair-minded, knowledgeable people can disagree with these questions. Maunang, it's important to have regulations, legislations to help us guide decisions. Because again, it is still a hot topic with no clear white and black answer. Okay? It's a gray area for sure. So, mana siyang naatay mga legislation sa testing. So, unsa ning mga legislation sa testing? These are, again, very Western-centric. And so, you'll just course through it para naatay at the back of our minds, we can compare what's the situation in the Philippines. So we'll go through them very briefly. You don't even have to memorize them, just understand them, okay? So first is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So unsa ni siya? This act made it illegal to alter test results based on race, religion, sex, or national origin. Okay, so this was actually very huge there. And next is the American with Disabilities Act of 1990. And it actually says that testing materials and procedures must be essential to the job and cannot discriminate against persons with disabilities. Next is FERPA sa 1974, wherein this law gave parents and students the right to access school records and challenge findings that they disagree with. Back then, there was a custom na dili i-share ang results. But because of this, it is an obligation for them to find out, okay, the finding. And then the HIPAA from 1996. So this established federal privacy standards and it limits use of use of data, especially sa health information. Okay, so very important ni siya in terms of data privacy. So including sa psychological assessment data, no, and how it can be used. It's limited. And the next is the IDEA pag 1997 and revised in 2004. It was first passed pag 1975 and it was amended a lot of times. Unsa ni siyang IDEA? It protected children with disabilities and requires assessments that don't inappropriately place children in special education due to cultural differences. So remember, katong kang Goddard na example. So this law was in place to prevent that from happening again. And then we have the No Child Left Behind. And it was kanang pag 2001, and it set strict accountability standards and required periodic assessments uh, to track progress. And ang battle cry ani is demographics are not destiny. Mo nilahang murag kuan big idea. And we have there's kanang truth in testing na legislation sa state level sa US, which requires disclosure sa test answers and mga development procedures. And yeah, this law right here, it actually created tension sa test takers' right to know versus ang right sa test developers to make every item kasi tagani ang test developers magud they argue na the items should be kept in secret because if they know how it is conducted, how it was developed, then dili na noon siya masakto ang pagkuha sa scores. For example, intelligence scores, and igani di ay ang pattern niya, pag score niya, manipulator siya. So, mana siyang, it's a tension between, oh, well, it's our right as test takers to know versus the item secrecy for the test to validly measure what it was supposed to measure. So, let's go sa testing sa Philippines. So, sa Philippines, ang psychological testing is regulated primarily through mga professional licensures, ethic codes, data privacy laws, and educational policy rather than a single comprehensive testing law. And dili pud siya anak specific with regards to US. Remember katong sa US na ay FERPA, IDEA, very specific siya sa unsa na sample, unsa na type of testing. Sa Philippines, very kuan siya kanang general in terms sa kuan, but we'll go through them. So kani siya si Psychology Act of 2009. Ang iyang gitest is this law is one of the most important law for testing sa Philippines. Ang usa may gi-cover ani niya na kanang law, no? Na ang psychological test, they are only administered and interpreted and reported by licensed professionals, psychologists and psychometricians. And that psychological tests are also considered professional tools. So they should not be used casually, especially in terms of decision making. Okay? And then lastly is to secure mga testing materials for to make it confidential. So nganong important ni siya? It prevents misuse sa test by unqualified individuals, and it protects examinees examinees from harmful interpretations. And this is parallel to the Civil Rights Act sa kanang US or sa Western laws. Now, next is the PRC law. It governs professional regulations of Philippines. And what this law actually does is it gives PRC to authority to regulate practice of psychology, and psychometrics, enforce ethical standards, and penalize unethical or illegal test use. And this is important because testing is not a technical task. It should be a regulated na professional act. And next is the Code of Ethics for Philippine psychologists and psychometricians. And ang gikuan gid anino is gi-highlight po diri ang valid and appropriate use for test materials in its intended purpose and must consider cultural context, language proficiency, and educational background. And kani siya murag more on siya sa idea, parallel siya sa idea or fairness in terms of testing by means of cultural background. But kay gi-highlight man gyud diri na one should not discriminate or label unfairly. Next is Data Privacy Act of 2012, and this is the Philippine equivalent sa HIPAA and FERPA combined. Unsa may gi-protect ani sensitive professional information. Yeah, gibutang gyud diri no na we're required to give informed consent, secure ang storage, limited ang access, and clear ang purpose sa data collection. And this matters so much because it prevents misuse of test data sa schools, clinics, HR, and research. We also have Mental Health Act sa 2018, and this expands protection for individuals undergoing psychological assessment. And again, results must not be used to stigmatize or discriminate. And we have education-specific policies as well sa naa sa DepEd, and we have the RA 10533. And it basically, these laws and DepEd orders all regulate testing to be inclusive and non-discriminatory. And they also warn against over-reliance sa standardized scores. So they encourage people or teachers to have multiple assessments, not just testing or not just plainly kaning mga test out na giroll out sa schools. And we have SPED policies as well. It's depend orders and child protection policies where children should not be placed as SPED programs solely based on test scores. Again, multiple assessment must be conducted still. And then last, we have the test security and intellectual property. So while the Philippines, we don't have the US style na truth in testing na laws, we do have this protection with regards to our intellectual property and testing material, which is the Intellectual Property Code of the Philippines. And it talks about the unauthorized reproduction, disclosure, or coaching using actual test items in an ethical and potentially illegal way. So everything here that we would like to emphasize and note is that testing, it does not happen in a vacuum. I have a test and I'm gonna roll it out and I'm gonna base my decision whether I hire this person or not, whether I place this person in a SPED program or not. It's not that kuano. It's not that kanang kuan. For lack of a better word, easy. So it's always regulated by law. But again, in the Philippines manggod, dili kay siya igana ka specific. Di po siya igana ka ayo ka, dare I say, kiha-kiha, daga kay kiha-kiha sa testing. Wala. We cannot see that kay, I guess we're also not so overly reliant on testing with regards to our decision making. Is what I can say ha in terms of sa kanang nakita nako, unlike manggod sa US, example sa US, grabe kayo ang SATs nila, di ba, ila nang mag-stress out gid sila ana. So kay kung dili sila taas og SATs, dili sila taas og test scores, dili sila kasud sa good colleges. Kay sa Philippines dili man ta ana, kay I heard na ang mga high school ron i-inflate daw ang scores para makasud og SUCs, even though dili deserving, right? So man ma-shock lang ka, ang student 90 line of 9 per dili kay bang mo basa, dili kasabot, or dili mo study, or dili nga na ba magliso siya catch up because na inflate di ay ang scores and dili gid to iya scores nga na siya, no, medyo blurry pa and vague. We need more developments in terms of legislation with regards to testing, especially in education. Let's move on and let's tackle a tough ethical scenario. So imagine you're a psychologist and during therapy, your client tells you they intend to harm a specific person. What should you do and where do you draw the line between confidentiality and public safety? So while you're thinking about the answer, I want you to know about a case in the US. It's a case, no, scenario wherein si Tarasov versus Regents of California, gikiha sila, kihaay ni, and what basically to sum it all up, they concluded with this one: protective privilege ends where the public peril begins. Kay remember, there is a law wherein you're not allowed to disclose any private information with regards to your client. Is what happens if this client says they're gonna harm someone. Say nakamoy client na schizophrenic. Sorry, people with schizophrenia, and they say na I'm gonna kill this and that because this person and that wants to kill me. I heard it in a dream. Nga na ba? So where does the privilege ends? It ends when there is already harm involved with another person or with your client. So mo na siya. This kinds of question, you will wrestle this throughout your career, and there's not an easy answers for this, but you should know your legal framework to help you guide your decisions on what you're gonna do. So maka-encounter jud ka ani mga ingani na types of kanang scenario, right, sa testing. So kato siya, ethical dilemma to siya, right? Na mo anak ang chair, mo anak ang inyong school principal, inflate na ang scores tanan din ha kay kanang para makasud na tanan og kanang good schools. And ikaw as a person that's administering the test, what decision will you take? Okay, then your decision should be guided by your integrity and also the legal framework that's existing para po you're protected, di ba? Speaking of, let's move on to sa rights sa test takers. So these rights protect human dignity in assessment process. Because remember, there is a dark history sa testing, and sometimes it's also still misused up to this day. So we have this one to help protect people taking the test or the test takers from unfair testing. So first is the right to informed consent. Now, test takers have a right to know why they are being evaluated, how the data will be used, and who will see the results. So for young children, this information should be given out to the parents or the legal representatives or their guardians. Okay, they should know why they're taking the test, how their test results will be interpreted, and how it will be used, how it will be reported. Second is the right to be informed of test findings. Sorry, nabali na ako kanisa una. So they need to understand their results in a clear language That's why I mentioned na you should not use jargons. It should be as simple as possible for them to really understand the results. And why does this matter? Because again, in the past, there was a custom na they hide, no? Because they're afraid that the test takers will be anxious, so they hide the test results. But now that's illegal. They need to know that is their right to know the results. And third is the right to privacy and confidentiality. Now, there's a legal concept called privileged information. And this is information that's protected from disclosure in court, in legal proceedings. And in most states, the psychologist client relationship is protected this way. So, kani siya very, in terms of, sometimes mga psychologists are called out in legal proceedings, and there are information that they can't divulge even if the court asks them to because it is privileged information. And then lastly is the right to the least stigmatizing label. So when reporting results, professionals should use the least harmful labels as possible. Why? Because there is a case. See the case of Iverson. She's a 9-year-old labeled as feeble-minded at the high-grade moron level. Now, this description, naamagid ni siya sa score interpretation sa test manual. But what happened was, naay ni spread out. No, naay ni spread out. Na mo ni gawa siyang test result and nabully siya sa school. Gikiha sa mama ang interpreter or ang psychometrician, ang psychologist, but wala na daog because sakto bantan na no na interpret man gyud siya ang dapat ato niya gikiha unta is ang school guidance counselor kay mao may possibly nag-spread sa information, allegedly nag-spread sa information. So there is now a change in that kaya na may law no na it's the right to the least stigmatizing level. So probably if si Iverson ni take na siya test sa karon, lahi na siguro iyang label no, so naa siguro siya sa sa may i-label ana sa kuan low or kuan naman ron ang mga intelligence test scores, below average, low, very low IQ, below average, average IQ, very high IQ, and then genius, di ba? So ana naman ang mga labels ron. Dili naman nga ni feeble-minded at the high grade moron level. Ako sad uy, makakuan ko na ngani na kanang test results na. Mauho sa jud ko. So labels matter, class. So they follow people throughout life, and these labels they affect how we are treated. So it's very important. And we're done. This must be your favorite word. And we're done because it is my favorite word. So let's wrap up with our key takeaways. First, historical context matters. So we know now na ang testing, it has a long history. It started from ancient China to the 19th century pioneers to modern science to what we know now as testing. And it's important to understand this history to help us avoid repeating mga mistakes in the past. And I'm particularly referring to the Goddard case, okay? And second is culture profoundly affects assessment. Mga language, nonverbal cues, cultural values, they all influence how someone performs on a test. And so, as assessors, we must be culturally sensitive sa testing in every step of the way, right? And then third, legal and ethical frameworks guide our practice. So there are laws behind all this. Though the Philippines needs more specific, highly specific laws with regards to testing. And fourth, test takers have rights. So we have the informed consent, the right to know the results, privacy, and of course, the right to the least stigmatizing label. And all these rights, they protect the test takers, they protect human dignity. So I'll leave you with this thought, okay? Quotable quotes, Char. The assessment enterprise requires not just technical skill, but also ethical wisdom and cultural humility. To give tests, you're learning to do so responsibly, ethically, and with respect for the people you serve. Right? We end here. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, have fun learning.